It was supposed to be a normal day. I woke up, got dressed, and headed out. But the moment I stepped outside, I knew something was off. The sky was overcast, and the air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I almost turned back inside. But I had a meeting, so I kept going. By the time I got to Hollywood, the drizzle had started, and the streets were eerily quiet. I was meeting my sister Michelle, and as I pulled up to the corner, I saw her standing there, her face tense. "Scylla, I just got a call from Dad," she said as I rolled down the window. "Joe's trying to reach you. Something's wrong with Elvis." My heart dropped. Joe Esposito, Elvis's right-hand man, wouldn't call unless it was serious. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Elvis had been in and out of the hospital this year, but it was never anything too bad. I told Michelle to follow me back home. I drove like a madwoman, ignoring red lights and nearly crashing into other cars. All I could think about was our daughter, Lisa, who was at Graceland. She was supposed to come home today. Oh God, please let everything be okay. I skidded into the driveway and ran to the door, my hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. The phone was ringing inside. "I'm coming," I yelled, running to grab it. "Hello, hello. Scylla, it's Joe." "Joe, what's happening?" "It's Elvis." "Please, don't tell me. Scylla, he's gone. He's dead." No, Joe, don't say that, please. We've lost him." I collapsed against the wall, my knees giving out. Joe and I both started crying, our voices breaking over the phone. "Joe, where's Lisa?" I managed to ask. "She's okay. She's with Grandma." "Thank God, Joe. Send a plane for me. I'm coming home." I hung up and fell to the floor sobbing. Michelle and Mom, who had just arrived, rushed to me. We cried together, holding each other tight. The phone rang again. I hoped it was a miracle, but it wasn't. Mommy, Lisa's voice said, "Something's happened to Daddy." "I know, baby. I'll be there soon. I'm waiting for the plane." "Everybody's crying, Mommy." "I'll be there as soon as I can. Stay in Grandma's room, okay?" I hung up, feeling helpless. The news hit the media fast. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friends, family, the press all wanting answers. I locked myself in the bedroom, desperate for silence. I just wanted to be alone. Elvis and I had been divorced, but he was still a big part of my life. We were friends closer than ever. We laughed about our mistakes, talked about the future, and now he was gone. I couldn't face the reality that I'd never see him alive again. I thought about our last phone call just a few days ago. He was excited about his upcoming tour, laughing about the Colonel's posters and his records. I wish I knew it would be the last time we talked. There were so many things I wanted to say, things I never got to tell him. I remember the first time I heard his name. It was 1956, and I was living with my family at Bergstrom Air Force Base in Austin, Texas. My dad came home one night with an Elvis Presley album. He said everyone at the PX was buying it. I put it on the hi-fi and heard Blue Suede Shoes. The music was wild, and Elvis was everywhere on TV, on t-shirts, even on bubble gum cards. My mom said he was a bad influence, but I was drawn to him. He was sexy, confident, and moved in a way that made my heart race. I was a shy, pretty girl, always the new kid at school. I felt more comfortable with boys, and people always said I was the prettiest girl in school. But I wanted more than just good looks. My family was my support, my world. My dad was strict, but he was the center of our lives. My mom was sweet and devoted, and we were close. When I became a cheerleader at 13, it took a lot to convince my dad to let me go to out-of-town games. We had our rules, but we also had each other. I found a small wooden box one day, hidden away in the attic. Inside was a folded American flag and a picture of my mom with a man I didn't recognize and a baby. The inscription read, "Mommy, Daddy, Priscilla." That's when I discovered a family secret, but right now, all I could think about was Elvis. My mind was a mess of memories, from the first time I heard his music to the last time I talked to him. I cried until I had no more tears left. The world outside felt different, heavier. I was alone, but I knew I had to be strong, for Lisa, for myself, for Elvis. I felt like the world had just turned upside down. I ran to call my mom, who was at a nearby party. She held me as I cried, telling me about my real dad, Lieutenant James Wagner, a Navy pilot who died in a plane crash when I was just 6 months old. 2.5 years later, she married Paul Beaulieu, who adopted me and loved me like his own. Mom suggested I keep this a secret from the other kids. She was worried it might hurt our family, but when everyone found out, nothing changed. She gave me a gold locket from my real dad. I wore it all the time and imagined him as a hero, watching over me when I was sad or alone. That year, I was nominated to run for Queen of Del Valley Junior High. It was my first taste of politics and competition, and it was tough because I was running against my best friend, Pam Rutherford. We had campaign managers who went door to door, asking people to vote for us and donate to a school fund. The person who raised the most money would win. I was scared this would ruin my friendship with Pam, but I didn't want to let my parents or supporters down. Dad kept reminding me to memorize an acceptance speech, but I kept putting it off because I was sure I'd lose. On the last day of the campaign, a rumor spread that Pam's grandparents had put in a $100 bill for their vote. My parents were upset because we couldn't match that, and even if we could, they didn't think it was fair. The night of the announcement, I was dressed in a new turquoise blue, strapless tulle net formal that itched. I sat next to Pam on the stage, and the principal announced the winner. She said my name, and I was in shock. I walked up to the podium, trembling, and realized I hadn't prepared a speech. I looked at my dad, who seemed disappointed, and I apologized to everyone. They clapped, and I felt a mix of happiness and guilt, because Pam and I weren't as close after that. Being elected queen was bittersweet, but it made me feel accepted. Then my dad announced we were moving to Wiesbaden, West Germany. I was devastated. Germany was so far away, and I was worried about leaving my friends. My mom reminded me that moving was part of our Air Force life. I finished junior high, my mom gave birth to baby Jeff, and we said goodbye to everyone. We promised to stay in touch, but I knew it wouldn't be the same. My friend Angela told me Elvis Presley was stationed in Bad Nauheim, West Germany, and we joked about meeting him. We looked at a map and found it was close to Wiesbaden. The flight to Germany was long and boring, but we finally arrived in Wiesbaden. We stayed at the Helene Hotel for a while, and then found a big apartment in an old building. We later realized it was a bordello, but moving was too expensive, so we stayed. I felt isolated and lonely, especially with the language barrier. School was tough because I was the new girl again, and I missed my friends from Del Valley. The Eagles Club was a place where American families went for dinner and entertainment. I'd go there after school, listen to the jukebox, and write letters to my friends back home. I'd play songs like Frankie Avalon's Venus and the Everly Brothers, All I Have to Do Is Dream and Cry. One afternoon, I noticed a handsome man in his 20s staring at me. He introduced himself as Curry Grant and asked if I wanted to meet Elvis Presley. I was skeptical but told him I'd ask my parents. Curry met my parents, and my dad checked him out. Curry was in the Air Force, and my dad knew his commanding officer, so they trusted him. On the night of the visit, I picked out a navy and white sailor dress. Curry and his wife, Carol, picked me up and we drove to Bad Nauheim. I expected Elvis's house to be a mansion, but it was a regular 3-story house with a white picket fence. Fans were waiting outside, hoping to see him. We went inside, and Elvis's dad, Vernon, welcomed us. The living room was plain, and Elvis was sitting in a chair, wearing a red sweater and tan slacks. He had a cigar in his mouth and looked even handsomer in person. Elvis smiled and said, "Well, what have we here?" Curry introduced me, and we shook hands. I was too nervous to speak, so we made small talk. He asked if I went to school, and what grade I was in. I told him I was in 9th grade, and he laughed, calling me a baby. I was a bit annoyed, but his charm melted away my resentment. Elvis played the piano and sang songs like Rags to Riches and Are You Lonesome Tonight? Everyone was captivated. He also did a Jerry Lee Lewis impersonation, and I was too nervous to laugh. Elvis noticed and tried to get my attention. He started singing just for me, and I felt special. Later, he took me to the kitchen to meet his grandmother, who was frying bacon. I told him I wasn't hungry, but we talked about music and his fans. He was worried about how they would accept him when he returned to the States. We talked for a while, and it felt like we just started when Curry said it was time to go. Elvis asked if I could stay longer, and when Curry explained my curfew, Elvis casually suggested I could come back. I got home late, and my parents were waiting up. I told them about the evening, and they were surprised. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about Elvis. I replayed every moment in my head. Then, a few days later, Curry called and said Elvis wanted to see me again. My parents were surprised but agreed. That night was much like the first, but after Elvis finished singing, he came up to me and said he wanted to be alone with me. He backed me against the wall and asked if I'd go upstairs to his room. I was panicked. I never thought he might want me that way. He could have any girl in the world. He said he wouldn't hurt me, and promised to treat me like a sister. I was flustered and confused, but he kept insisting. Standing there, looking into his eyes, I felt drawn to him like I had no control. It was easy to believe him because his intentions always seemed warm and sincere. We stood there for a while, and then I nodded. "All right, I'll go." He took my hand and led me to the stairs, whispering which room was his. "You go on ahead, and I'll join you in a few minutes. It looks better." He went to the kitchen, and I slowly climbed the stairs, wondering what he would expect from me. I had dreamed about this moment, thinking it would never happen, and now here I was, about to be alone with him for the first time. I reached the second floor and found his bedroom. It was plain and simple, just like the rest of the house. I went in and sat down on a stiff chair, waiting. Elvis didn't show up after a few minutes, so I started looking around. The room was ordinary, with books, records, his uniforms, and boots. There were letters from girls in the States on his night table, many from someone named Anita. Elvis rarely mentioned Anita, but everyone knew he had a girl back home. I wanted to read the letters, but was afraid he'd catch me. It was another 20 minutes before he finally appeared. He came in, took off his jacket, turned on the radio, and sat down on his bed. I hardly looked at him, scared of what he might want from me. But instead of grabbing me, he said, "Why don't you come over here and sit next to me?" I was hesitant, but he reassured me that I had nothing to be afraid of. "I really like you, Priscilla. You're refreshing. It's nice to talk to someone from back home. I miss that. It gets a little lonely here." I sat next to him, not saying much, but I was touched by his vulnerable, boyish side. He told me that our relationship was important to him, and that he needed me. He was scheduled to return to the States in 6 months, and he said he knew lots of girls, but I was the first one he felt close to. I leaned into his arms, feeling safe. He held me closely and said, "I just wish Mama could have been here to meet you." He sighed and looked troubled. "She would have liked you as much as I do." I whispered, "I wish I could have met her," moved by his sincerity. Elvis told me that his mother, Gladys, was the love of his life. She had died a few years ago from heart failure. He blamed himself for not being with her when she fell ill and had to be sent back home. He missed her so much and was worried about going back to Graceland without her. He said she had started drinking, and he was concerned about her. Her fear of losing him had been too much for her to handle. Elvis also talked about his dad dating Dee Stanley. He was upset because it was too soon after his mom's death. He didn't trust Dee and didn't want his dad to change. He told me about how his dad and Dee were always exchanging love notes, and it made him feel uncomfortable. I felt for him that night, as he shared his problems and worries. Despite being a famous singer, he was a lonely man. Our visit ended too soon. He kissed me goodbye, and it was my first real kiss. I had never felt such a mix of affection and desire. I was speechless, but felt a strong connection with him. By our fourth date, my dad said, "If you want to continue seeing Elvis, we need to meet him." My parents weren't swayed by his fame. They wanted to make sure he was good for me. I told Elvis that my parents wanted to meet him, and he agreed, but he wanted to bring his dad along. On the day of the meeting, I got ready early, playing Elvis's records to calm my nerves. My dad came into the room and said, "Do you have to play those records now? He'll be here soon, and you see him practically every night. Can't you take a break?" I was nervous, wondering how Dad would react. When Elvis and his dad arrived, Elvis was wearing his uniform to impress my dad. He looked great. He kissed me on the cheek and asked, "Are your parents here?" I nodded, and he continued, "We're a little late because I had to get cleaned up, and we had trouble finding the place." I smiled, knowing it took him hours to get ready. Elvis shook my dad's hand and said, "Hello, I'm Elvis Presley, and this is my dad, Vernon." He addressed my dad as Captain Beaulieu or Sir, which impressed him. The conversation was mostly small talk, but my dad asked about Elvis's job in the service. "Sir, I'm basically driving a Jeep for the 4th Armored Division in Bad Nauheim," Elvis said. "That can be tough this time of year," my dad replied. "You're not kidding, sir. We've had some cold nights out there already." My dad then asked, "What do you do for fun?" Elvis said, "I like to spend time with Priscilla. She's a lot more mature than her age, and I enjoy her company. It gets lonely being away from home." My dad asked if Elvis would pick me up and bring me home. Elvis explained that he had a tight schedule, but he promised to bring me home every night. My dad agreed, and Elvis reassured him that I would be well taken care of. After the meeting, Elvis and I went for a drive. He told me he was lonely and unsure about how his fans would react when he returned to the States. He had been at the top of his fame when he joined the Army, and he was worried about losing his fans. Every minute I wasn't with him, I thought about him. I was disappointed when he forgot to call one night, because he was focused on his karate lesson. I had to learn not to take his forgetfulness to heart. It was just his way. Elvis's life was challenging when he wasn't at the base. Fans were always around him, making it hard for him to do simple things like going to the movies. He had to plan everything carefully to avoid the crowds. Even leaving the house required someone to drive his car in front, so he could run out and get in before anyone noticed. Time was my enemy. Elvis was due to return to the States in a few months, and I wanted to spend every moment with him. Many evenings when Elvis had early morning call times, either Lamar Fike or my dad, Vernon Presley, would drive me to and from 14 Go the Stress. One evening neither Lamar nor Vernon could take me, so Elvis asked a friend Kurt to drive me home. Kurt was not his real name, but it's what I'll call him. It was a quiet drive back to Wiesbaden. I was tired and started dozing off. Suddenly, the road got bumpy. I opened my eyes, confused. "What's wrong?" I asked Kurt. "You'll find out," he said, turning his head away. He had driven off the highway onto a dirt road. The only light was from a distant house. The rest was pitch black. I started to get scared. "What's going on?" I asked, but Kurt didn't answer. He stopped the car and turned off the ignition. I repeated my question, but Kurt didn't answer. Instead, he turned and tried to kiss me. I pushed him away, struggling. He threw me down on the seat. Panicked, I begged, "Don't leave me alone." I started fighting back. I kicked the door opened the driver's door with my hand, and simultaneously hit the horn, the lights, and scratched at his face. Kurt gave up, frustrated and afraid of being caught. The rest of the way home, Kurt didn't say a word. I just sat there, sobbing, disbelieving, and praying I would get home safely. 3 days passed before I heard from Elvis. My parents knew something was wrong, but I couldn't tell them about Kurt. I feared I wouldn't be allowed to ride with him again, and I didn't know how I'd get to and from Elvis's if Lamar and Vernon weren't available. I was too scared to tell Elvis because I thought Kurt was his friend. I started to think maybe Elvis knew what Kurt had tried to do. Maybe I was just a plaything to him. I was tortured by these thoughts. Finally, Kurt called and said Elvis wanted to see me. I had no choice but to go with him. During the drive to Bad Nauheim, Kurt didn't mention what had happened, and neither did I. I was very apprehensive. I didn't know if he would try to touch me again. I had no choice but to tell Elvis. That evening, when we were alone in his room, Elvis asked if anything was wrong. My voice was trembling. I could hardly get the words out. When I finally told him, Elvis went berserk. "I'm going to kill him," he shouted, pacing the floor and cursing Kurt. He said I was his little girl, and he had never gone all the way with me. Now this other guy, this so-called friend, had tried to rape me. I listened, secretly relieved by his response. How could I have ever doubted Elvis? Elvis was so angry. It took me the whole evening to calm him down. I convinced him we had to keep Kurt's attack secret from my parents, or I'd never be allowed to come back. Elvis held me tightly, as if trying to take the painful memory away. He felt guilty for putting me in such a dangerous position. From that day on, Kurt was virtually excluded from Elvis's life. I don't think Elvis ever told him why, but Kurt must have known. He rarely came around after that. I began to realize that Elvis expected total loyalty from his friends. If he was betrayed, he would just cut that person out of his life. Vernon was now sporting a neatly trimmed mustache, which Elvis said D. Stanley had encouraged him to grow. Our conversations in the car were somewhat perfunctory. and I always sensed he'd just as soon be doing something else, like spending time with Dee, who sometimes accompanied him. These days, when I arrived at 14 Go the Stress, I'd often find Elvis upstairs studying karate with his instructor or downstairs in the living room, proudly demonstrating new moves to his entourage. They stood around, marveling at his mastery of this newly popularized art form. Elvis also spent hours with a half-mad German masseur, who convinced him he could rejuvenate his facial skin with secret treatments. Joe Esposito ribbed Elvis, saying, "What the hell's he doing that's so special? You look the same to me." Defensively, Elvis shot back, "Well damn, he says it'll take some time before you see the results." Vernon added, "Time, yeah. Probably enough time to bankrupt us all by what he's charging. I wouldn't trust him farther than I could throw him." Always a center of activity at the house was Elvis's grandmother, whom he nicknamed Dodger. Elvis came up with the name when he was a small boy of 5. During a temper tantrum, he threw a baseball that missed her head by inches. He jokingly said, "She dodged out of the way so fast." He started calling her Dodger from that moment. Grandma took care of the household, did the cooking, and kept everyone and everything under control. She had the air of a person with a firm purpose in life, which was to make sure Elvis was well cared for. When I sought quiet while Elvis practiced karate, Dodger's room was a place to escape. We'd sit for hours, and she would tell me about the old days, about Gladys and her boundless love for Elvis, about the struggles the Presleys faced. She had been with Vernon and Gladys from the time of Elvis's birth, helping out when Gladys took jobs to support the family. A strong woman, Grandma had prevailed when her husband left her with 5 children. She wanted you to believe she held a grudge against J.D. Presley, but Dodger's was a forgiving heart, and I believe she still cared for him. She helped raise Elvis as if he were her own son, somewhat spoiling him as grandmothers do. She always rushed to his defense when she felt Gladys was too stern. Dodger said to me, "Gladys always called me Mrs. Presley from the time I first met her until she breathed her last breath." One day Elvis came running in and said, "Hi, Minnie. I felt so sorry for that young'un." Gladys rose up, took her hand to that boy, and said, "Don't you ever call her by her first name. That's disrespectful. She's your grandma." He cried for an hour. I went in and said, "Son, it'll be all right. She was just doing what she thought was right. Now you go in and apologize to her." Poor little boy looked at me with those blue eyes, so pitiful. Oh, she could be hard on him. He was a good boy, though. Never really got into any trouble. Always came right home from school and did his chores. Yes, and Gladys would watch over him like a hawk, so scared he'd be hurt. He wanted so bad to play football at school. Grandma rocked back and forth in her chair, seeing something in the past that made her start picking at the bobby pins in her hair. She reached for her little box of snuff, took a dip, situated it just right, and then continued to reminisce. Yes, he loved sports. Then why didn't he go out for any, Grandma? Oh no, Gladys wouldn't have that. She'd tell me, "Oh, Mrs. Presley, I couldn't stand it if Elvis got hurt. It would kill me. I've watched how they play out there in those fields. They get real rough. I think they enjoy hurt in each other. Elvis isn't like that. He'd get out there and he'd be like a wounded bird in a pack of wild dogs, not my young'un." Gladys's constant effort to protect Elvis, I learned, was the result of her anguish over the death of Elvis's twin brother Jesse Guerin. I came to love Dodger and what she represented: compassion and total devotion to her family. My biggest problem in those days was that Elvis and I never seemed to have enough time alone. People were always dropping by, standing around the living room talking and laughing until Elvis came down from his room. As soon as he appeared, the room would become silent until he revealed his mood. No one, including myself, dared joke around unless he laughed, and then we all laughed. Because I had to share the little time I had with Elvis with so many others, I began to feel jealous and possessive. It was only late in the evening, when we were in his bedroom, that I was truly happy. We had a nightly ritual. At about 10 or 11, Elvis would glance at me and look toward the stairs. Then, naively assuming that nobody knew where I was headed, I'd casually proceed to his bedroom, where I'd lie on his bed, impatiently waiting for him to appear. When he joined me, he'd lie as close to me as he could. "I love you," I whispered. "SHH," he said, putting his fingers to my lips. "I don't really understand what it is I'm feeling. I've grown to love you, Scylla. Daddy keeps reminding me of your age and that it can't be possible. When I go home, only time will tell." Each night that I was with him, He entrusted a little more of himself, his doubts, his secrets, and his frustration. It was a lot to expect an impressionable 14-year-old to understand, but I tried. I felt his pain over his mother's death. I ached over his desire to become a great actor like his idols Marlon Brando, James Dean, Carl Malden, and Rod Steiger. I was concerned about his fears that he might not regain the popularity he felt he'd lost by serving in the army. And I reveled in his laughter when he asked, "What if one day I end up back driving a Crown electric truck? Wouldn't that be something?" I was there for him to listen, to hold his hand, or to make a funny face that would turn his frown into a smile. Sometimes Elvis would enter his bedroom in high spirits. I longed for those nights when he'd shut off the lights and lie close beside me. "Sweetness," he would say, putting his arms around me. "You're so pretty, honey." And then we'd kiss long, deep, passionate kisses, and his caresses would leave me weak with desire. Nights when his mood was calm and peaceful, he would describe his ideal woman and tell me how perfectly I fit this image. He liked soft-spoken brunettes with blue eyes. He wanted to mold me to his opinions and preferences. Despite his reputation for being a rebel, he held traditional views on relationships. A woman had her place, and it was the man who took the initiative. Fidelity was very important to him, especially on the woman's part. He constantly reminded me that his girl had to be completely constant. He admitted that he was concerned about Anita. She was a Memphis beauty queen and television personality. Elvis said that lately her letters had become very impersonal, and he suspected she had been with another man. Despite his moralizing, I feared Elvis wasn't always faithful to me. His bantering with some of the other girls at his house made me think that he might be intimately familiar with them. One evening he was playing the piano for the regular group, plus a couple of English girls. When he picked up his guitar, he looked around but couldn't seem to find his pick. "Anybody seen my guitar pick?" he asked. One of the English girls looked up and smiled. "It's upstairs on the night table next to your bed. I'll get it." All eyes, including mine, zeroed in on her as she made her way up the stairs, aware that she was now the center of attention. Furious at his obvious betrayal, I turned to him, but he was avoiding my gaze by looking down at his guitar, plucking it as if it needed tuning. Then he burst into "Lottie, Miss Claudie." Without a pick, his fingers must have hurt badly, but no matter what, he wasn't about to put that guitar down. He knew he was in trouble. After he'd finished a medley of songs, Elvis excused himself and retreated into the kitchen, with me right behind him. "Have you been with her?" I demanded. "No," Elvis insisted. "Then how did she know where your guitar pick and room were?" "She was over one night, and I mentioned how dirty the place was," he answered, a boyish grin on his face. "She offered to clean it, simple as that." Despite his declaration of innocence, I was not reassured. He was the sexual idol of millions, and could choose whomever he wanted, whenever he wanted. I quickly learned, for my own survival, not to ask too many questions. As the weeks passed, school became an unbearable chore. After getting to bed so late, I found it difficult to rise at 7 and almost impossible to concentrate. But I knew that if I ever complained about being too tired or was late for school, my parents would put a stop to my seeing Elvis. My study habits became worse. I was failing algebra and German, and barely passing history and English. At the end of the fall semester, I altered the D- grade on my report card to a B+, praying my father would never consult the teacher. I kept telling myself that I would do better, that I'd catch up, but my concentration was totally on Elvis. One night when I went to see him, I fell asleep while waiting for him to finish his karate class. When he came downstairs and saw how exhausted I was, he asked, "Priscilla, how many hours of sleep are you getting?" After a second, I said, "About 4 or 5 hours a night, but I'll be fine," I added quickly. "I'm just a little extra tired tonight, because we had some tests at school today." Elvis looked thoughtful and then said, "Come upstairs a minute, I have something for you." He led me up to his room, where he placed a handful of small white pills in the palm of my hand. "I want you to take these, they'll help you stay awake during the day. Just take one when you feel a little drowsy, no more than one, though, or you'll be doing handstands down the hallway." "What are they?" I asked. "You don't need to know what they are. They give them to us when we go on maneuvers. If I didn't have them, I'd never make it through the day myself. But it's okay, they're safe," he told me. Put them away and don't tell anyone you have them, and don't take them every day. Just when you need a little more energy. Elvis honestly thought he was doing me a favor by giving me the pills, and I'm sure the thought never entered his mind that they could be harmful to him or me. I didn't take the pills. I put them in a small box with various items I had started to collect, such as cigar holders and little personal notes he had given me, and hid the box in a drawer. Later, I learned that the pills were dexedrine, which Elvis had first discovered in the army. A sergeant had given several men pills to help them stay awake while on guard duty. Elvis, who was accustomed to living the life of an entertainer and who despised rising at dawn, began taking the pills to get him through the long, dreary hours of army life. He told me he'd begun taking sleeping pills shortly before he'd been drafted. He dreaded insomnia and feared sleepwalking, which had plagued him periodically since childhood. It was Christmas 1959, and I was walking through the crowded streets of Wiesbaden, trying to find the perfect gift for Elvis. My dad had given me $35, which seemed like a fortune, but it wasn't enough for the beautiful handmade cigar box I found in one shop. The price was way over my budget, so I left with nothing but a fancy taste in my head. The snow was falling heavily, and I rushed into a toy store hoping to find something. There was a solid German train set that I thought Elvis would love, but it was way too expensive. I was starting to feel hopeless, and almost cried as I walked home in the dark. Then I saw a music store with a pair of bongo drums in the window. They were inlaid with gleaming brass and cost $40. The clerk took pity on me and sold them for $35. I wasn't sure if the drums were the right gift, but I decided to give them a try. I asked Joe and Lamar if they thought Elvis would like them, and they reassured me, but I still had my doubts. On the night we exchanged gifts, Elvis handed me a small box. Inside were a delicate gold watch with a diamond and a ring with a pearl. I had never owned anything so beautiful. Elvis's smile made me feel warm, and I told him I would cherish these forever. He made me put them on right away and showed everyone. When it was my turn to give him the bongo drums, I was nervous, but Elvis laughed and said, "Just what I always wanted." He could see I didn't believe him, and tried to convince me. He even played "I'll Be Home for Christmas" on the piano, and I couldn't help but cry. Seeing him hold back, tears made me love him even more. Days passed, and I began to dread Elvis's departure. He was packing, and each night we spent together became more precious. Then, just as the weather turned freezing cold, Elvis was sent out on field maneuvers for 10 days. He hated sleeping outside on the frozen ground. The next day it started snowing, and by afternoon it was a blizzard. Michelle and I were driving home from school when we heard on the radio that Elvis had been rushed to a hospital with tonsillitis. I was frantic with worry and called the hospital. The operator put me through to Elvis, who sounded raspy but asked if I could come. My parents gave me permission, and an hour later, I was in his hospital room. Elvis was propped up in bed, surrounded by flowers. The moment the nurse left, he took out a thermometer, lit a match, and heated it up. When the nurse returned, she checked the thermometer and gasped, 103. "You're really sick, Elvis." He nodded and waited for her to leave, then burst out laughing. He hated maneuvers and had faked the illness to avoid them. The night before Elvis was to leave Germany, we were lying on his bed, hugging each other. I was in complete despair, worrying that I would never see him again. "I just wish there were some way you could take me with you," I said, sobbing. "I love you so much." Elvis kissed me gently and said, "I love you too, Scylla. I don't know what to do, but maybe being away will help me understand my feelings." That night, our lovemaking was intense, and I wept, knowing it might be the last time we would be together like this. The next morning, I was back at Elvis's place, waiting to say goodbye. He came downstairs, laughing and joking with everyone. When it was time to go, he turned to me. "Okay, little one, it's time to go." I followed him out, and we got into the car. The fans went wild, and we sped to the airport. Elvis held my hand as we walked to the plane. The guard stopped me from going further, and Elvis gave me a brief hug. "Don't worry, I'll call you when I get home, promise." I nodded, but before I could answer, the crowd pulled us apart. He ran up the boarding steps, turned and searched for me. Our eyes locked for one last moment, and then he was gone. My parents drove me back to Wiesbaden, and during the ride I was silent. For the next 2 days, I locked myself in my room, unable to eat or sleep. My mom told me to try to move on, but it was hard. At school, reporters and photographers swarmed me, asking questions about Elvis and Nancy Sinatra. I felt sick and excused myself. Days turned into weeks, and I became more resigned to the fact that Elvis had forgotten me. But 21 days after he left, the phone rang at 3 in the morning. I ran to answer it and heard Elvis's voice. "Hi, baby, how's my little girl?" I told him how much I missed him, and he assured me he would always call. Elvis started his first movie, G.I. Blues, and I worried about his co-star Juliette Prowse. He told me not to worry, and I was relieved. But a few weeks later, he called sounding disappointed. "I hate the movie," he said. "There are too many songs, and it's a joke." He had a meeting with Colonel Parker, but it didn't go well. He was miserable. I lived in a state of waiting, hoping for Elvis's calls. Sometimes he would call after 3 weeks, other times after 3 months. He always talked about his movies, co-stars, and sometimes about Anita. I wasn't sure where I stood, but I loved him and wanted to be a part of his life. It was a cold, snowy day in March 1962, nearly 2 years since Elvis had left Germany. In the late afternoon, I got a call from him. It had been months since we last spoke. "I'd like to make arrangements for you to visit me in Los Angeles," he said. "Do you think we can work it out?" I was stunned. "What? I'm not sure. Oh God, I wasn't expecting this. It's going to take some time, some planning." I blurted out. I didn't think my dad would ever let me go. I talked to my mom, hoping she could convince Dad. Elvis promised to meet all of Dad's demands, wait until I was out of school for the summer, send a first-class round-trip ticket, provide an itinerary, chaperone me, and make sure I wrote home every day. The next few months dragged on. I marked each day on the calendar, counting down until we'd be together. Finally, the day arrived. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, I saw Joe Esposito, who still worked for Elvis. He gave me a big smile and a warm hug. "You look great," he said. I didn't feel great, but his words made me feel better. I was scared that Elvis might be disappointed when he saw me. We drove to Elvis's house on Bellagio Road. It was a beautiful Italian villa, a world away from post-war Germany. As we entered, Elvis's butler, Jimmy, greeted us and said, "Mr. P is in the den." We walked downstairs, and I heard music and laughter. Elvis was leaning over a pool table, ready to make a shot. He looked up, saw me, and his face lit up. "There she is," he shouted, throwing down his cue stick. "There's Priscilla." He ran over, picked me up, and kissed me. "It's about time," he joked. "Where have you been all my life?" I was nervous with all the people watching, but Elvis held my hand and introduced me around. "Baby, I'm so glad you're here," he said. "You've grown up, you look great, let me look at you, stand up." I felt self-conscious as his eyes surveyed me. He looked thinner and happier, but his hair was now dyed black. He kissed me and went back to his game. I felt out of place, but the girls told me he talked about me often and showed my pictures around. Later, when the party slowed down, Elvis suggested we go to his bedroom. "Up the stairs, the first door to your right," he said. "The lights are on, I'll be right up." I waited a few minutes and then went up. The room was luxurious, but it had a welcoming feel. I saw the king-size bed and thought about all the women who might have been there. I couldn't think about it anymore. I took a quick bath, got dressed, and stood by the door, nervous. Elvis came in and locked the door. "Where are you, baby?" he called. "I'm in the bathroom," I shouted. "I'll be just a few more minutes." "Come on, Scylla, I want to see my girl." I opened the door and walked over to the bed. We lay down and he held me close. "You don't know how much I've missed you," he whispered. "You've been an inspiration to me. I haven't been able to put you out of my mind since I left Germany." I started crying and he held me tighter. "It's gonna be all right, baby. You're here now, and that's all that matters." We lay there and it felt so tender. He discovered I was still untouched and he was relieved. "This can get out of hand," he said. "Not yet, not now. We have a lot to look forward to. I just want to keep you the way you are for now." I didn't argue. It sounded romantic, and I trusted him. Later, he told me I had to stay with his friends, George and Shirley Barris. I didn't understand, but I got out of bed, and Joe drove me over to the Barrises' house. The next day, Elvis called and asked if I wanted to go to Las Vegas. "Tonight, we'll load up the bus and head out about midnight," he said. I was excited but worried about my parents. Elvis said Alan would take me shopping and help me write letters to send home from Los Angeles. That evening, Elvis's house was bustling with activity. The bus was being loaded with everything they needed. Just before midnight, we all said our goodbyes, and we were off to Las Vegas. I was finally going to be with Elvis without any restrictions. It felt like a dream come true. I was still dazed from the trip when we pulled into Las Vegas. Elvis yelled out the window, "We shall return," and we hit the highway. Gene was on my right, and I was in the middle, with Elvis driving. He always preferred driving at night. It was cooler, and there was less traffic. He came alive after dark, and on this night he was in great form. We were all listening to music, nibbling on snacks, and drinking Pepsis. In the front seat, Elvis and Gene joked in their own language. Elvis would say something, and Gene would reply with a complete non sequitur. When the conversation lagged, they started playing surprise attacks, punching each other. If Gene thought he'd landed a good one, he'd run to the back of the bus, knowing Elvis could always pull over and chase him. These antics went on for most of the drive. I felt out of sync with their private jokes and crazy hijinks. It was clear that the boys picked up on Elvis's every mood, but I didn't fit in yet. We arrived in Las Vegas around 7 in the morning. I was tired and falling asleep when Elvis called out, "We're comin' into Vegas. Look around, all you see is hotels. It's called Sin City. Isn't that right, Smith?" Gene mumbled a silly reply and Elvis laughed. The strip looked quiet. There were a lot of taxis, some cars, and a few tired people strolling along the streets. It was extremely hot for 7 a.m., especially since it was only June. We checked into the Sahara Hotel. Despite the early hour, the place was bustling. Elvis pointed to the casino, noisy with the rhythmic sounds of slot machines, the sporadic ringing of bells, and occasional yells from the craps tables. "Is this normal?" I asked Elvis. "Honey, you ain't seen nothin' yet. Wait till tonight," he replied. Despite being tired, I stood fascinated, watching the gamblers. Elvis took my arm. "Come on, baby, let's go up to the room. There'll be plenty of time for this later. We better get some rest." We followed the bellboy to the suite. The entourage quickly arranged the rooms to Elvis's liking. They unpacked his clothes, placed them neatly in his closet, lined up his shoes by color, and set out his toiletries in the bathroom. In the living room, they set up his record player and speakers, lowered the lights, and turned on all the television sets. "Why do you always have the TV on?" I asked Elvis. "It keeps me company. When it's on, I feel like there are people around," he said. He despised entering a quiet room, and soon I too adopted the habit of turning on the TV whenever I walked into a room. An hour later, the suite looked lived in, with everything in its proper place. Elvis said good night to the boys and cautioned them not to wake us too early. He locked the bedroom door, got undressed, and into bed. As I climbed in beside him, I noticed he was taking a number of prescribed sleeping pills, but I didn't pay much attention to them. I wasn't knowledgeable enough to suspect any potential threat. I lay there blissfully happy. Finally, we were able to spend an entire night sleeping together. Elvis was looking at me. "Do you believe this, baby? After all this time, here you are. Who'd ever have thought we'd pull this off? Let's not even think about you going back. We'll have a good time. We'll think about the other when the time comes." His words were starting to slur. His reaction slowed down. He pulled me closer and told me again and again, "I'm glad you're here," and then silence. I looked over at the bottles of pills near the bed and realized I still had competition. When I awoke the next afternoon, I snuggled against Elvis. He put his arms around me, holding me as he slept. I studied his eyebrows, his long black eyelashes, his perfect nose, and his beautiful full mouth. After a while, I ached from lying in the same position but didn't move. It might wake him. He must have sensed I was staring at him. He suddenly opened his eyes and started to laugh. "What are you doing? If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were putting a hex on me." "I couldn't sleep," I said, embarrassed. "I guess I'm too excited." Sitting up, he said, "Well, little girl, the first thing I need is a cup of black coffee. Press number 4 on the intercom and tell Billy to order us some breakfast. He knows what I like, and just tell him what you want. Tell him to have it here in half an hour and to make sure the coffee's hot." Getting out of bed, He flipped on the TV and walked into the bathroom. A moment later, he stuck out his head and grinned. "Get dressed, little one. I want to show you off a little." That was all I needed to hear. I jumped out of bed and ran into my bathroom to get ready. As I dressed in a casual summer outfit, I could hear music coming from the living room. I cracked open the adjoining door and was surprised to see all the boys up and dressed, with breakfast set up on the dining room table. I finished combing my hair and walked out to the living room, where the guys greeted me with friendly smiles and hellos. Elvis wasn't there yet, so no one had begun eating. Everyone was pretty quiet, and it felt like early morning, even though it was after 4 in the afternoon. About 15 minutes later, Elvis came into the room, all dressed up in a 3-piece suit. I realized that nothing in my wardrobe was suitable. He walked over to the stereo and put on his latest record, saying he'd just finished a recording session and wanted me to hear the songs. Then we all sat down for breakfast. It was fun hearing his recordings before they were released. He asked me what I thought of each song. "I really like the fast-paced ones," I said, "like Jailhouse Rock. Why don't you record more songs like that? These don't seem as much like rock and roll as your earlier records." Elvis shot me a look of pure disgust. God admit, he snapped. "I didn't ask for your opinion on what style I should sing. I asked if you like the songs, that's all yes or no. I get enough amateur opinions as it is. I don't need another one." He got up and stalked into the bedroom and slammed the door. I was embarrassed and confused. What was wrong with what I'd said? How could that upset him so? Lucky for me, the boys had already left the table and were all doing odd jobs or were in another room. I didn't know if any of them had heard Elvis's tirade, but I didn't want to face them. I knew Elvis had a temper. I had witnessed it in Germany, but never before had he directed it at me. Slowly, I rose from the table, wondering where to go. Elvis's bedroom door was still tightly shut. I hesitated to go in for fear he'd start yelling. Not knowing what else to do, I sat down next to the albums and started going through them, pretending to look interested. Soon I heard the bedroom door open and saw Elvis standing in the doorway. He motioned for me to come over. Reluctantly, I put back the records and walked into the room, fearful of what he was going to say. He closed the door, sat me down on the edge of the bed, and to my surprise began to apologize. "I'm sorry, baby. What happened before really had nothing to do with you. I just finished that recording session, and it's pretty damn good compared to what they usually want me to do for these movies." He talked more about his last film, the storyline, the songs, the dialogue, all of which he thought were inane. I was beginning to understand some of his frustrations and dissatisfaction. I remembered our talks in Germany. Elvis had been proud of his film accomplishments before entering the army. He had talked hopefully about doing movies with more substance and fewer songs. "Scylla, from now on I plan to keep my singing career and my acting career strictly separate," he said. He believed he was capable of performing more demanding roles and still studied certain actors he admired, like James Dean in Giant and Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront and The Wild One. "But I keep getting offered the same musicals, same storylines," he complained, "and they're getting worse and worse." His biggest problem was that these films and their soundtrack albums were always huge hits. Shaking off his serious mood, he grabbed my hand and said, "Come on, baby, we're going shopping." This was Elvis's way of making up for his outburst, but it took me a little while to get over it. Forcing an enthusiastic smile, I went along. I was beginning to understand how everyone's mood played off Elvis. Taking Jean and Alan with us, we jumped into a waiting limo and rode around until Elvis spotted a boutique where glamorous gowns made of sequins, lace, and frills graced the beautiful mannequins in the window. He called out to the driver, "Let's stop here." Taking my hand, he led me inside, followed by the entire entourage. The salesgirl was speechless. "Hello, ma'am. I'm Elvis Presley, and we're just looking around. Maybe you could show us something that might interest my little friend over there." The look on the clerk's face told me we were thinking the same thing. These clothes were far too sophisticated for such a young girl. But when Elvis saw something he liked, he didn't think in terms of age. While the saleswoman went to the back to rummage around for whatever she had in sizes 6 and 4, Elvis was rifling through the racks, pulling out a number of dazzling creations, asking me which ones I liked. "They're all beautiful," I said. "I just don't know how I'd look in them." "You let me be the judge of that," he said, winking at Jean, who mumbled one of his non sequiturs. We all dissolved into fits of laughter that brought the shopgirl rushing back with a huge selection of dresses. Elvis designated his preferences and said, "Try them on and pick out any others you like." Thrilled, I chose a half-dozen gowns with matching shoes and headed for the dressing room. The salesgirl followed. Away from Elvis's eyes, she treated me like a little kid, but I was so enchanted with the clothes that I didn't care. As I posed in front of the mirror in a long black jersey gown and a pair of gold high-heeled sandals, I hardly recognized myself. I definitely appeared older, very sexy, and very sophisticated. As I stepped out of the dressing room, the salesgirl mumbled, "Not bad for a kid." Elvis took one look and said, "Hot damn, we'll take it." We stayed for over 2 hours, while Elvis bought me not only the black sheath, but also a midnight blue satin, several lovely silks and chiffons, and a beautiful baby blue brocade gown, all accented by matching capes and bags and shoes. When we left the shop, a crowd had gathered. Elvis glanced at Alan, who immediately disappeared. Then he gave a number of people his autograph, said goodbye, and Jean quickly led us through the back of the shop and out the door, where Alan was waiting with the car ready to take us to the hotel. Back at our suite, Elvis said, "I'm hungry. Joe, order me a steak, but make sure you tell them well done. What do you want, honey?" "Hell-E," Joe said. "I always tell them well done." "Well, tell them again," Elvis shot back. "I'll be goddamned if it doesn't always come back half raw." To Elvis, raw was slightly pink. Everyone specified burnt when ordering for him. Elvis turned to Alan and said, "Hog ears." He had pet names for all his employees. "Make arrangements for Red Skelton's midnight show, and see if there's anyone in the hotel who can do Scylla's hair and makeup." "Hair and makeup," I said. What's wrong with my hair? It was long and dark brown, casually combed. But beyond feeling he didn't like my hair. Now I began to think he didn't like my looks. "There's nothing wrong with it, honey. It's just that this is Las Vegas. Everyone has their hair done. You need to apply more makeup around your eyes. Make them stand out more. They're too plain naturally. I like a lot of makeup. It defines your features. Defines your features." At that time, it made a lot of sense, and Elvis knew best. While we waited for dinner, Elvis put one of his records on the stereo and sat next to me, singing along with his own voice on the record. In that moment, I fell in love all over again. When he sang about lost love or a life lived out in grief and pain, he delivered the lyrics with such conviction that I'd feel the hurt. He'd been a fan of country music since long before it became popular, and was always impressed by the raw emotion in those recordings. After dinner, we got ready for the evening. At Elvis's request, Armand, a hairdresser at the hotel, came in and spent nearly 2 hours creating my new look. He teased and twisted up my hair with one long curl, falling in front of my left shoulder. Then he applied my makeup so heavily that you couldn't tell if my eyes were black, blue, or black and blue. It was that look of the 60s, only more extreme. That was what Elvis wanted. When I put on my brand new brocade gown, my transformation from an innocent 16-year-old to a sophisticated siren was complete. I looked like one of the lead dancers in the Foley's Berger. "Goddam, what happened to little Scylla?" Elvis said when he saw me. "You look beautiful. Joe, come here, look what I found." Joe walked in and did a double take. "Sure doesn't look like the same girl we met in Germany, wearing a sailor dress," Joe said. Everyone laughed, and we left to see Red Skelton's midnight show. We arrived just after the lights went down, and the maitre d', using a flashlight, quickly led us to our table. Elvis always tried to arrive unnoticed, so he wouldn't distract attention from the headlining star. But word always spread throughout the audience that he was there, and within a few seconds the whispering would start, and heads would turn. Elvis handed me a tiny, honey-colored puppy on Christmas morning. "Merry Christmas," he said, his eyes shining. "Oh, Elvis," I exclaimed, carefully picking up the little pup. "He's so cute and so small." I hugged Elvis, and the puppy yelped softly between us. "Oh, honey," I said, laughing. I'd just given him a name. Honey was the perfect gift, a symbol of our love and the bond we were building. I'd been back at Graceland for a few days, but it felt like I'd never left. The house was full of Elvis's friends and family, and everyone was in high spirits. The mansion was beautifully decorated for Christmas, with a nativity scene on the front lawn and the white columns glowing with holiday lights. But the best part was being with Elvis. We spent most of our time together, talking, laughing, and just enjoying each other's company. He showed me around Graceland, pointing out his favorite spots and sharing stories from his childhood. I loved hearing about his mom and dad, and how much they meant to him. Even though his dad's marriage to Dee was still a source of tension, Elvis was trying his best to be happy, and to make the most of the time we had together. One night, we were lying in bed, and Elvis told me about his dreams for the future. He wanted to make more movies, record more music, and maybe even buy a place in California. But no matter where his career took him, he always wanted to come back to Graceland. It was his home, and he wanted it to be ours too. I felt a warmth in my heart that I'd never felt before. Being with Elvis made me feel safe, loved, and complete. I knew that our time together was precious, and I was determined to make the most of every moment. The next few days flew by in a blur of laughter, music, and family gatherings. On Christmas Eve, we all gathered in the living room to exchange gifts. Elvis's dad, Vernon, and his stepmom, Dee, were there, along with his friends and relatives. Despite the tension between Elvis and his dad, there was a sense of warmth and belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. After the gifts were opened, Elvis took me aside and said, "I want you to know how much you mean to me. You've made this Christmas the best one I've had in a long time. I'm so grateful you're here." I smiled and wrapped my arms around him. "I'm here because I love you, Elvis, and I'll always be here for you." On Christmas Day, we spent the afternoon playing with Honey and relaxing by the pool. The sun was warm, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and the bark of the puppy. It was a perfect day, and I didn't want it to end. But eventually, the time came for me to say goodbye. My parents were waiting for me back in Germany, and I knew I had to go back. Saying goodbye to Elvis was hard, but he reassured me that we would see each other again soon. He promised to visit me in Germany, and I believed him. As I boarded the plane, I held Honey's tiny paw in my hand, a reminder of the love we shared. I looked out the window as the plane took off, and I saw Graceland getting smaller and smaller. But in my heart, I knew that no matter where I went, a part of me would always be there with Elvis. I closed my eyes and thought about the future, about the adventures we would have together, and the life we would build. I knew that even though we had to be apart, our love would only grow stronger, and I couldn't wait to see what the future held.